Okay, British and American culture students. So far, it's been an interesting term. Let's have a little heart to heart here. Let me just try and encourage you a little bit, considering all the things that are happening. This is Friday. Chuseok is, the following Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Tuesday is Chuseok holiday. So I know everybody's going to be busy and traveling. And I already told you that I'm going to upload a lecture on Tuesday as well, okay? Now, the most important thing, the thing that's bothering everybody and causing everyone to email me is the attendance not completing. So let me share with you something, okay? I can see each one of you, how long you've studied. I can see you've watched for 13 minutes out of 45, or I can see that you've watched for 900 minutes out of 45 and you didn't pay attention, you just fell asleep. You just turned on the lecture and you fell asleep, and 18 hours later you turned it off, okay? I can see that. You don't need to send me your screenshots. I have 180 students to keep track of. I don't need a screenshot every week for you to say, Professor, look, it says 46 minutes out of 45, but it's not complete. I can see that. I'll fix it. I'm not gonna fix it now because it's gonna take forever if I have to. My hope is that the people who handle the computer system will fix it for us. If not, I will go through student by student, week by week, and make sure the attendance is correct, okay? So everybody calm down. I'm not angry, I'm just tired of getting emails and everybody panicking. You don't need to panic. I'm not an evil professor. I'm not gonna fail you because the computer system doesn't work, okay? No more emails with screenshots. If you would like to tell me, Professor, the system still isn't working, just letting you know. Thank you, that's fine. But don't email me and say, Professor, here's my 3 weeks of attendance, please fix it now. No, I'm not going to. I already know there's a problem. I'm not going through every individual. So just be patient. I will fix everybody's attendance. Even if it takes me 25 hours sitting at my desk, I'll have to do that, right? We've been complaining to the administration and the people who program the system constantly, okay? It's not my job to do that. Otherwise, I would be checking it as I went. So the good news is, even if you don't keep a record of it, even if you don't keep a screenshot, I can see it on the back end. When I log in as an administrator, I can see 47 minutes out of 45. So if you go across the line and it doesn't say complete, don't worry. I know, I can see it, okay? So we're cool now? Good. Now, let's get back to business, because that is annoying stuff. Let's get back to business. So we're doing British culture. As I told you, this isn't really British culture. We're mostly talking about just England. We talked about Scotland a little bit, and soon we're gonna, talk about a little bit about Scottish stuff, Celtic and Scottish and Irish stuff on the side. But basically, we're just following the history of England because that is the senior partner of the British culture. So for the test, for the quiz next Friday, we will be doing it on Google Forms. And I don't trust the system anymore. It worked last year, it worked last semester, but who knows what'll happen this time. So there will be a link. There's supposed to be a link to a form, a Google form. You have to log in at 10 o'clock. You have to put in your name, your email address, and your student number. It has to be correct. Your student number has to be correct. Your email has to be correct. If you mess up your name, I don't care. Spell it however you want. Korean or whatever your nationality is, Uzbek or Kazakh or Chinese, it doesn't matter. But your student number and your email have to be correct. Student number has to match. You can only submit the form once. You can't do it again. And you have 10 minutes exactly. At 10:10, the form closes and you cannot submit. So don't submit it at 10:09:59. If it lags, you won't get the submission. Don't cut it close. Like really just finish by 9:09, submit it, and you're safe, okay? If you cut it close and there's some internet, problem and something, it loads slowly or it submits or there's an interruption, there's nothing I can do except you get a 0, okay? So don't cut it close. I know Korean internet is great and it's really fast, but don't chance it. Okay, so what's on the quiz? The format of the quiz is 10 questions. The questions are related to chapter 1 and the part of the introduction I talked about last lecture, okay? Now, one of the other things that I should stress to you is I'm trying to make this like a real classroom. And although I don't, really check participation because the class is too big, sometimes this class has 100 people in it, there's always people who get credit for their attendance and they're in the back sleeping, or people that sneak in the back. And then at break time, because we used to do it by hand, I used to have to check by hand, but in the last few years I had an app and everybody would have to, turn on their app and I would check to see who was in the class. And some people, like I would usually do it at break time, and some people would come in 20 minutes late and they would still get credit. This is gonna happen on the internet too. I know some of you are not paying attention to this lecture. I will be able to tell who's paying attention and who's not when you do your assignments and when you do your quizzes and tests and exam. It becomes obvious that some people have watched the videos and they haven't taken notes and they haven't listened and they haven't paid attention and they don't understand, okay? So again, don't be the attendance thing. If you're a good student and you get an A+ on every test and you miss one lecture, you're not gonna get a low grade because of that. Missing one lecture doesn't matter anyway in terms of attendance, but you're lucky. I post all of these. If this was a real class and you skipped a class, you would never get a chance to see that lecture again. It's gone forever. But if you skip 2 classes or you're sick, all you have to do is go to YouTube and go to the week that I lectured and then watch it. You can watch it a month later if you miss one. If you're sick, you can watch it later. You don't have to ask your friends, for their notes or ask what Professor Sullivan said in class because it's all there. You can even watch last semester and see what I said last semester, okay? But trust me, it is different. It's the same plan, but what I say and what I emphasize and what I test is different. So don't think you can go back, to 2020 and cheat or something like that. That will not work. You have to watch this because the class is constantly evolving. All right, so 10 questions, chapter 1, plus I mentioned the context, right? Historical, cultural, and social context. I mentioned that last week, plus cultural dynamics. So right here, I wrote it on the board for you to see. What's on the test? The first quiz, chapter 1 and the introduction, page 38 to 43. So that's the cultural context plus what I'm going to talk to you right now, which I call cultural dynamics. Now this is a very simple idea. I learned this when I was in second year from a great English literature professor named Dr. Mary O'Connor. And I studied it was an introduction to American culture. And I haven't borrowed that many things from her classes because it was contemporary mostly, and mine's the whole thing. And there's a lot of ancient stuff and medieval and modern stuff. But she was talking about, mostly about America in the 20th century, because I was going to school. I started university in 2000, so, contemporary culture was 20th century, not 21st. Anyway, the way that she described it is that, we always have culture, and there's always a mainstream culture, there's always a popular culture that has the power. The important thing is that it has power. It doesn't matter if it's military power, political power, social power, what we call soft power, right? Maybe economic power, sort of what Korea is doing right now. It's soft power, right? People like Korean K-pop and K-dramas and Korean food. I have one of my old professors, her daughter is only 15 years old, but she wants to come to Korea next summer. I found this fascinating. She wants to come next summer for a couple months and study Hangul in Seoul. It's like the reverse of the typical thing that I see is all these young Koreans saying, I'm professor or teacher, I'm gonna go to California for 3 months, or I'm gonna go to Alberta in Canada for a semester. Now there's apparently Canadians and Americans that want to come to Korea to learn Hangul even, and of course she's a big BTS fan. What is that? What is that? What's happening there? Korea's culture is growing its influence, but not by pointing guns at people and taking over countries. It's called soft power. It's certainly it's entertainment, but there's a certain set of messages being broadcast, and it's a benefit economically. BTS just went to the Blue House, and got some fancy award like Ambassador of Korea from Moon Jae-in. I saw it in the news. That's why are they getting awards for that? They're not ambassadors. It's because their influence is actually, it adds to the effect, the power, the dynamic between Korea as a country, as a culture, in the entire world. That's soft power. That's a cultural relationship. Now, that one's very complicated, and global cultures are very, very complex. But let's just keep it simple here and just talk about larger things. So, whatever culture has the most influence, we call that one dominant. Okay, and constantly there's a change. That's why, again, I love the word evolution for my textbook, because at certain times there's different dominant cultures, right? And when the dominant culture is dominant, it uses different means, devices and strategies. Maybe it's not on purpose, it just does things that affect everything, right? So for example, Korean culture is essentially basically a Neo-Confucian culture where, you have to respect older people, and there's dynamics between, men and women, traditionally, the family, right? We have this structure, and Chuseok is coming. So that is still the dominant culture in Korea, but it's changing. It's becoming less dominant because there are other cultures. It's not the only culture around, right? Some people are not observing traditional Chuseok, ceremonies and going to the cemetery and meeting their families. They're doing all sorts of things. Now, they're not trying to fight against Neo-Confucianism. They're not trying to overthrow Korean traditional culture. They're just not doing the same thing. So there's sort of different relationships between the dominant culture and the other cultures. So let me go back to our subject. I'm just illustrating for Koreans, and of course international students. I would love to talk about your countries too, but we don't have time, and well, you're in Korea, so it's good for you to learn about Korean stuff too, or maybe already. But let's go back to British culture, okay? So we originally have the Celtic culture there. It's dominant. They're all a little bit different, but they all have the similarities because the cultural umbrella, even in France and Belgium, is Celtic. That's why I kept using the word Celtic instead of Britain, because I didn't want to confuse you, because later we have the British. So those Briton people, that transformed into the Romano Britons, they were Celtic. When the Romans came, they dominated by force, by every means they could, right? By education, by force, by economic power, right? By threat of violence. They dominated for over 300 years. And as a consequence, at first, Boudica and many other tribes of Britons fought against them. That would make them a counterculture, right? They're trying to counter through force. Now, you can protest, you can hide, you can dress differently, right? You can show your resistance to a dominant culture many different ways. You can refuse to learn Latin, and just speak Celtic languages, right? It refuse to remove your tattoos or change your hairstyle or wear clothing or shave your beard. There's many different ways. It's a counterculture is resist. That's the main thing. Okay. Subcultures kind of exist and have different aspects, but they don't actively fight against the dominant culture. Okay. So, example, the Romano-Britons, once the counterculture has been crushed, and after many years of mingling with the dominant Roman culture, you end up with this kind of hybrid subculture called the Romano-Britons. These Britons who behave like Romans, but they're still, in some ways, connected to their Celtic roots. And even the Celtic people, the majority of the people in Britain are still ethnically Britons, and they still have their villages, they still have their farms, but when they go to London, it's Roman style. But the subculture is out there, it's everywhere, it's in the countryside, it's all around the Roman bases, it's all around the Roman walls, everything, there's a subculture just waiting there, right? But the thing is, it's 300 years, and after 300 years, there's really no counterculture left. So when the Romans leave, what's left is this subculture, and they're unable to become dominant. So the Angles and the Saxons come in, and they're very aggressive, they're confident, and they're warriors, and there's debate about this, but some people think that really the Romano-Britons, they definitely fought, but the story was that the Angles and the Saxons came in and killed everybody and basically replaced them, and that's why we speak English. But lately there doesn't seem to be a lot of proof of all these huge battles and deaths, and they've done genetic evidence to show that British females especially are descended from Celts, from Britons, right? So this means that yes, they fought and they killed Britons, but mostly the men. And many of the Angles and Saxons married Celtic women, right? And in the countryside, many of the men who didn't fight were not killed. So the dominant genetic type in England is Briton, is a Celtic, right? So what happened was the Anglo-Saxon, eventually what became the Anglo-Saxon culture, dominated, and there was really no countercultural movement except for a few instances, and that's where the legend of Arthur comes from. The legend of Arthur is about a counterculture. And the thing that's funny, like I said, is that when they started writing the stories about Arthur in the 12th century, when Richard the Lionheart was going on crusade and stuff, when everybody started falling in love, they were writing in French about Arthur, who was a person who would have spoken Celtic or Latin. He was a Romano-Briton, and he was a person who would have fought against the Normans, the Vikings, or the Anglo-Saxons. So they took Arthur, who was a symbol of counterculture, and they turned him into a dominant cultural symbol because they appropriated him for the Anglo-Norman narrative. Okay? Now, my multiple choice questions are not going to be that hard, but that's how you work it out. That's an easy way to work it out. Which culture is dominant? Which one is countercultural? Let's just take something simple. Somebody asked me, is there anything about American culture on this? No. I know in the introduction, I talk about America a little bit, but we're not doing America yet. But a great example of a counterculture is the American Revolutionary War. The dominant culture is British. They're part of the British Empire, and the 13 colonies decide they want to break free, or they want at least representation, but then eventually they decide to break free, and they decide to go to war about it. That's a counterculture being developed, and then the full manifestation of it is a war. And then when the counterculture wins, it becomes the dominant culture, the American Republic. Cool stuff, I think. Okay, now that's all the stuff that's on the quiz. So everything from this point, we're at 20 minutes here. Okay, this is all new stuff. If you want to just, watch this later and study, but here's the line, okay? Chapter 2, here's the line. This stuff is not on the quiz. This is for quiz number 2, okay? So this is one of my favorite stories, and it's one of the most important, so I'm going to try and tell it as much as possible as a story. But when you want to know the details and you want to study, I think it's more fun for me to tell it as a story, for you to understand it, and then for you to read the textbook afterwards and say, oh, that's what professor was talking about. That's what I prefer to do. You can pre-read if you want, but I really think after you listen to me explain, in a simpler way, or put together kind of a story that's more interesting, then look at the details and then highlight stuff in your book. Or, as I said, you can go to the slides. People are all concerned, Koreans especially, are always concerned about, is it on the test or is it not on the test? Do I have to know everything? You don't have to know everything. I know it's a lot of stuff, but the slides are there to help you understand better. It's not to make a pile of information that's impossible to remember. Most of the slides match. If you've looked at the slides, most of them match this. Just don't look for slides that are not in the book or in my explanation, because I'm not gonna look for slides that I've taken out, okay? But most of the slides have beautiful pictures, and they talk about Alfred, they talk about Arthur, they talk about things that are, and in some ways there's simpler explanations in the textbook. So please, it is another resource. This is the textbook and me are your primary resources, but here's an example. Slides 4 to 13, they explain the cultural dynamics and the cultural context, and they give pictures. It's the same as the book. Slides 4 to 13, it's exactly the same, basically. Page 43 onward has a bunch of pictures, the mosaic of Arthur, pictures of Alfred, descriptions of what he did. And in between there's pictures of London and Romans and stuff like that. And I think if you see those slides, I'm not asking you to memorize the information. I'm just asking you to remember the information I've already given you. So if I explain to you about the Romans and then you look at a Roman and you see, oh yeah, he's got pretty good equipment for an ancient warrior, and he's shaven, and they're all in a line and they got shields, they look very disciplined. I know they're good engineers. And you look at a Celtic warrior and the village looks like, it's made of basic materials, and the Celtic warrior is wearing no shirt, he's got tattoos. These things probably help you remember the information for the test. It's not giving you more information, just kind of completing the picture. Okay, so look at the slides, in particular these ones, if you like. You don't have to, but I'm just saying they're there as another resource. Now, what we're supposed to talk about today is the Normans, okay? So the question is, who were the Normans? Let's talk about that very quickly first. We've been talking about Vikings already, and around 800 AD, Lindisfarne was attacked. A Christian monastery was attacked by some Vikings, and they killed a bunch of people, and they took all the gold and the cloth and the valuable things from the monastery, and they kept attacking churches, and that's because they were not Christian. They didn't care, and the church usually had the most money. There weren't any banks, so sometimes even wealthy people in the town would put some of their valuables in the church, and the church would keep it for them. So basically, the question is, you ask a thief, why do you rob banks? And then the thief would say, because that's where the money is. A Viking would say the same thing. It's not because they hate God or they want to destroy Christianity. It's just like, well, there's a whole bunch of buildings, and that building has all the money in it. So let's attack that one and kill the people and steal the wealth from there. So that's what Vikings did. Nowadays we try to balance that. They were traders too, but they were famous warriors, and people were terrified of them. But of course they were bringing products and goods all over the place. They were master seamen. They started up north in Europe in the North Sea, and they made it all the way down around Italy to Jerusalem. They conquered places all the way around the edge of Europe. The Viking Age lasts about 200 years, more than 200 years really. And some of the Vikings come to England, Ireland, and everything. Some of them keep going. They go all the way down to Italy and Jerusalem, like I said. So some of them come to Normandy, right? And it's called Normandy because of them. So these Vikings, Vikings just means, being a pirate, sailing and stealing. But they never called themselves Vikings. Viking was more like a verb. So let's go Viking, which would mean like let's jump in a boat and go steal some things from people or attack somebody. But at the time they just called them Norsemen, right? The people from the north, the Norsemen. So these Vikings, these Norsemen, came to France, and at the time the French king wasn't very powerful. He wasn't able to defend France from them. So they basically just didn't leave. And when they were unable to effectively fight them, the King of France said, okay, listen, you can stay here, but you have to be my vassal. You will be the Duke of Normandy, and I will be the King of France. So you owe me allegiance. So when I fight other people, you gotta, bring your warriors and fight me, and you gotta send a certain amount of taxes. And when your son is born, he has to be, given. He has to perform the ceremonies and show the respect of rank to the King of France, even though at some points the Duke of Normandy might be almost an equal. This is the way the structure of the society works. So this is a pretty good deal for the Duke of Normandy now, suddenly, because he's a Viking, and now he has, instead of going back to Sweden with some stuff and fighting, bloody battles, instead he settles there and they mix, they become Christian. That was one of the rules too. They become Christian, but they're still not French. There's a big difference. There's a funny story about, a French king coming and asking, the Normans to pay homage to him, like by bowing and like kissing their feet and stuff. And the Normans, the Normans refuse to do that. Like there's just certain things, like they're not Christian warriors. They are still berserker Norsemen at heart. And they don't follow these, ceremonial. They don't have good manners in some sense, and they don't show the respect for the king. Like you're supposed to walk up and bow to the king, and the Normans refuse to do that. They won't show their respect by bowing. They refuse to do that. They have too much pride. So there is a little bit of tension there between the Normans and the French, but they learn to speak French. So they are kind of French Vikings, and they're in the northern part of France. They have a relationship with England because when Edward's grandparents were kind of thrown out by the Danish people, by the Vikings, they ran away to Normandy. So there's a connection between Normandy and the Dukes of Normandy, especially with the English and the Danes. So, as I said to you before, Alfred, his Anglo-Saxon line ends, and then there's Canute. So there's a Danish king, then it goes back to Anglo-Saxon when Edward becomes the king, and then Edward dies, but he has no kids. So now who's going to be next? There's three choices. There's an Anglo-Saxon, powerful Anglo-Saxon person named Harold Godwinson, and his father's family was very powerful, most powerful rich family in England. It's him, or perhaps a Danish king, right? Danes still have, Canute, not that long ago, several generations ago, Canute was the king, or the Duke of Normandy is also related through his grandmother or great aunt. He has a relationship too. He's related to the Anglo-Saxons through his mother's side. So those are the three different people who are vying for the throne as Edward gets old and sick. Now, right at the beginning of the chapter, one of the most important things is what I call the chapter is called the chain of being. So let me explain before I talk about what happens with William and Harold and Hardrada and Tostig, these people who are going to fight for England. Let me just explain what the chain of being is. The chain of being is basically an order, all living things, right, from God and angels all the way down to humans through to dogs, frogs, insects, rocks. The whole world is ordered this way. It's sort of a Aristotelian. You say in Korean, you say in Greek, they say Aristoteles. We say Aristotle. It's kind of an Aristotelian ordering of all things, all living things. And they adapt this to the Bible. So the heavens and the angels and God are at the top. And then they put the human beings are within a chain as well. So there is a chain going from the Pope and the kings and the upper class, the nobles, the yeomen, the peasants, the serfs, the slaves, and then animals. Okay? So this chain of being is essential to the order of the medieval world, because after the Roman Empire falls apart, basically it all breaks up, and in order to keep the stability in local areas, we have like basically pockets of warlords, and you have lords and peasants sort of living together in a kind of contract, and they end up becoming stuck in that land. They end up becoming serfs, and they have to stay in that land in order to get the protection of the soldiers and the wealthy person in their county or in their village or in their town. They either have to have enough money to pay some taxes, or they have to work as a farmer, and they have to give part of what they grow to the person who owns the land, which is usually the landlord, right? A wealthy person like a duke, a count, a prince, or a baron, something like that. Okay, so this is called feudalism, and this is important for everyone to know that if you're born as a serf, you're gonna grow up to be a serf and do the same thing as your dad, get married, have babies who are also serfs, and the cycle will continue. The chain of being basically likes everything to stay the same. Now, of course, it's not a perfect, stable system, and people do change levels, but essentially the expectation is, you're in this class, you're in this life because God put you there. So accept it and play your role. Now, increasingly in this course, from here onward, people are going to think that's not good enough, right? That's one of the major themes of this course, is that something that drives revolution is that people are unsatisfied with the social system. So that drives this interest in revolution. That's what happens. As I told you, the British culture isn't very revolutionary. But that's because they're always basically they avoid revolution by constantly changing a little bit. So we'll get to that. But this moment is truly revolutionary, almost in a backwards sense, okay? Because in some ways, what happens after Hastings is going to make the English society more oppressive, and so later they will look back and say, oh, before the conquest, before the Normans came, we were free, which is not true. But there is that's why Alfred the Great is Alfred the Great, and William the Bastard is William the Bastard, because Alfred the Great presided over a more optimistic time. Was it actually that much better? I don't think it was exactly a golden age, but later on people compared the Anglo-Saxon period as a time where people were freer than after the conquest. So quickly, this is what happens. Harold Godwinson is in England. Edward the Confessor is dying. He goes into a coma. They know he's dying. He wakes up and he says, at the last minute, he says, Harold, you will be the next king. So Harold gets to be the next king. However, he's not related to Edward or any of Edward's ancestors. He is an Anglo-Saxon, but I think he has some Danish blood in him too. Anyway, he's very wealthy and he's very capable, so he's a good choice. However, William is related to Edward, and there's a story that years before, Harold was in Normandy. He was in a ship and he crashed in Normandy, and William captured him, and William made him promise that when Edward died, if he had no heir, that the claim to the throne would be William's. This is the story. Nobody knows if it's true or not, but Harold did crash and he did go to Normandy, and William and him ran around fighting and doing some battles, and then he went back. Now the thing, William is not called the bastard because he was a bastard, like a bad person. It's because his mother was not a duchess. His mother was just a normal, ordinary person. And so his father was a duke, but his mother was not a noble. So he was a bastard, and he was not supposed to be the duke. But there was some, conflict in his family, and when he was very young, he fought against his uncle and other people who were trying to take over the duchy. And even though he was only a teenager, he managed to survive, and then he managed to defeat everyone and unify Normandy. So even though he's young, he's already been a fighter, and he's good, and he's famous, and he's respected. So Harold, also capable, knows how to fight, good leader. Harold has taken the throne of England. William doesn't like it, so William says to the Pope, I want to go on a holy crusade and get my inheritance. That's my crown, my throne, and I want you to bless my effort. And the Pope agrees that this is a crusade. So he can go across, and anybody who does it, even though they're fighting against another Christian kingdom, I guess the Pope wants more control over England. So he supports it. That means anybody who fights in there kills another Christian person. They're not going to go to hell for that. So he managed to gather together a pretty large army, and then he goes and waits for the weather to improve so he can take his ships across and attack England. Harold knows that's going to happen, so he comes down. He's sitting at Dover waiting for William to come across and fight him. While that is happening, Tostig, who is, you don't need to remember this, but Harold's brother, who was basically ignored by Harold when he became king, and he didn't give him, enough land or wealth. He was really angry about that. He goes to the king of Denmark and says, you know what? Let's take over England. You come with me. Let's take it back for Denmark. I'm on your side. So Tostig switches sides, and then a whole bunch of Vikings land in northern England. While in the south, Harold is waiting to fight William. So Harold, being an awesome military leader, gathers all his men together, marches as fast as he can all the way to northern England, meets, and he marches basically so fast that Tostig and Hardrada are completely surprised. So they've already killed a whole bunch of soldiers and looted, and they're just relaxing, not expecting to fight. And Harold comes out of nowhere. The Vikings don't even have their weapons, and they fight, and the English just completely massacre the Viking force. Very few of them get away. There's thousands of them that get killed because they're completely surprised, for one thing. And that's the last time. It's a very important battle, Stamford Bridge. Nobody talks about that one because 3 weeks later, there's a much more important battle. But Stamford Bridge is really important because that's the last time there's any major Viking invasion. There's lots of raids and stuff, but never again will there be a big Viking army that lands anywhere in Northern Europe and causes a huge amount of damage. So they finish the Viking. That's the end of the Viking dominance of the north area. It's done. So that's a pretty amazing thing. And then Harold finds out, so he starts going home. He thinks that basically William has given up because the weather is too bad, but then suddenly the weather improves. William jumps on his ships and goes across to England. Harold is already letting his men go home to their farms when he hears this. So he quickly tells them, no, don't go back to your farms. Come back. And everybody gathers, and then they force march down to London and decide, I think they should have taken a rest for a few days. After marching for 3 weeks and fighting thousands of Vikings, they don't take a break. This doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, they march right past London to a place called Hastings, and they block the Norman approach to London. So there at Hastings, Harold and William fight. And I'm not going to give you the details because it's going to take too long. But basically, the Normans charge. The English line holds several times. The battle keeps going. It's very vicious. Many people die. Eventually, the English think that they're getting the advantage because the Normans keep attacking them, and their line is breaking and they're running away. So the English start chasing the Normans, and when they chase the famous Norman knights, their heavy weapons and their big horses, they basically run down all of the English soldiers because they lose their discipline. And the story is that Harold gets hit in the eye with an arrow, but who knows? Anyway, he dies in the battle, and the Normans have a victory, and then they march on London. And really, after these 2 battles in 3 weeks and the loss of a king who just became king 9 months ago, it's the same year. So this is why 1066 is the most important year, because Edward dies, Harold becomes king, the Viking Age is over, Harold dies, the Normans take over, and William the Bastard becomes William the Conqueror. Okay? Now, I think I'll save the details about what the Normans are like who were the Normans. I just gave you the background. They're Viking French people, but they have they speak French. That's a fundamental thing. But I'll talk about how they reorganize England and what happens to the society and why it becomes a revolution. It could have gone differently, but it really does become a revolution because there is a rebellion, there is a reaction, and William decides to alter the way English society is organized. So we will talk about that on the special Chuseok Tuesday lecture, and we'll stop here at that point with William the Conqueror being crowned King of England and he's still Duke of Normandy as well. He'll be crowned King of Normandy on Christmas of 1066. Okay, so have a lovely Chuseok, and please remember, don't worry about your attendance. Just listen to the lecture, make sure you know the material, and we'll figure out the attendance later. It's not a problem. I'll deal with it. Okay? Happy Chuseok, and see you next week.